Thank you for joining us tonight. My name is Melissa Rosen. I'm the Director of Training and Education at Charchet. And tonight we're going to have a very important conversation about clinical trials. Thankfully, more people are aware of their heightened risk, and greater numbers of cancer patients are living long and meaningful lives after treatment. It makes sense that in the last decade or so, there are more and more opportunities for clinical trials beyond basic treatment trials that we are all aware of. Some of these include prevention, lifestyle, survivorship, and more. And we're going to hear about them tonight. Before we begin, I have a few housekeeping items to share. I'd like to thank our sponsors for today's webinar, our sponsors enable us to continue to offer meaningful programs. The sponsors of this evening's webinar are Daiichi Sankyo, Eisai, GSK, PMV Pharma, and the Cooperative Agreement DP 240061 from the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention. The webinar is being recorded and will be posted on the Charchet website, along with a transcript for you to use as a resource. Participants' names and faces will not be in the recording. We now have closed captioning available. To display live captions, simply on the bottom bar, click Captions and then Show Captions. You also have the option to be anonymous during today's live webinar. You can turn off your camera and even change your name in your Zoom square. The instructions are in the chat box now on how to make those changes if you wish to do so. A reminder to our Embrace community as we get started. We invite members of our Embrace community, those facing metastatic breast or advanced ovarian cancer, to stay on at the end of the webinar for an intimate breakout session with our expert speakers and with Bonnie Beckoff, our Director of Support Services. We received many questions throughout the registration process, and as questions continue to arise during the presentation, please use the chat box, and we will do our best to address as many as possible during the Q&A at the end of the webinar. As a reminder, Charchet has been providing telehealth services to the breast and ovarian cancer communities for more than 20 years because cancer is so much more than a physical experience. If you are interested in finding out more about Charchet's free, confidential, and personalized services, please email us or visit us at our website, charchet.org. Before we welcome our clinical trials experts, we are so very fortunate to welcome Linda, a Charchet program participant with her own experience with a clinical trial. Linda had a 40-year career in elementary education before she was diagnosed with advanced ovarian cancer. In the years since, she has become a committed and energetic advocate for women's health. One of the ways she does that is by sharing her story with both Charchet programs and through many other programs and organizations. So I am going to welcome Linda to the screen to share a little bit of her story tonight.
Thank you. In the summer of 2017, I was diagnosed with stage 4 ovarian cancer. The images showed too much cancer, and I needed to have chemo treatments to shrink the tumors before my surgery. Upon hearing the diagnosis from the oncologist, I shut down, could not process what he was saying. I told my husband that he had to listen. My husband, Jeff, was aware of clinical trials dealing with immunotherapy and mentioned this to the doctor. It turns out the oncology office was involved in a stage 3 trial for avelumab. The drug was already approved for another cancer, and the trial was being run to see if it was effective for ovarian. I needed to have a biopsy to see if I qualified for the trial. The only downside, the process would postpone the start of chemo. I had the biopsy, qualified for the trial, and was randomized into the group getting the drug, which I received during every third chemo treatment. My chemo treatment and entry into the phase 3 trial started in August of 17. The trial conducted in a comprehensive manner. Study doctors and technicians were there whenever I received the avelumab. They ran batteries of tests with associated blood draws. The trial called for avelumab infusions over 18 weeks of my chemo regimen, followed by a 2-year maintenance phase. In the fall of 18, I developed a hernia and another surgery was scheduled. Before being wheeled into the operating room, I reminded the doctor about a cyst that had shown up on an earlier scan. It turns out that the cyst was attached to my appendix, and when the surgeon took a closer look, he found early stage appendiceal cancer. After 15 months, the trial was halted. I was devastated, especially as the trial oncologist was confident that the drug was going to be approved. However, the data apparently showed an efficacy level below what was needed to approve the drug for ovarian cancer. The trial oncologist said he was going to approach the trial sponsor to see if the drug could be given to a handful of patients in his domain. The sponsor refused. I was lost. I didn't know what to do, but I wanted to remain proactive. My oncologist suggested HIPEC, a procedure in which hot chemo is infused directly into the peritoneal cavity. Turns out that HIPEC has been shown to significantly reduce recurrence risk of both ovarian and appendiceal cancers. I underwent the HIPEC procedure in May of 19. In a few months, I will celebrate 7 years NED, no evidence of disease. I'm grateful for my doctors, for the trial, and the support of my family and friends. One closing note, while the trial ended prematurely, my oncologist reviewed the data and was confident that avelumab helped me. Thank you.
Linda, thank you so much for sharing your story. I really do believe that hearing other people's stories makes it easier for us to understand difficult information. So really, thank you for doing that for us this evening. Okay, we're going to now move into the main part of our presentation, but I want to, before we do, remind you that Sharsheret is a national nonprofit cancer support and education organization and does not provide any medical advice or perform any medical procedures. And the information provided by Sharsheret and by tonight's speakers is not a substitute for medical advice or treatment for your specific medical condition. You should not use this information to treat or diagnose a particular condition. Obviously, always seek the advice of your physician or a qualified health provider with any questions you have specific to you. We are so very fortunate to have 2 additional speakers with us today. Our first speaker is Dr. Maryam Lustberg. She will be speaking about the different types of clinical trials, including some that are unexpected and go beyond treatment protocols. Dr. Lustberg holds an MD and an MPH, and she is a breast medical oncologist currently serving as the Chief of Breast Oncology and Director of the Breast Center at Yale Cancer Center in New Haven, Connecticut. She is the co-chair of Symptom Intervention for Alliance Clinical Trials and is the immediate past president of MASCC, an international organization devoted to improving cancer supportive care throughout the globe. Clinically, she treats men and women with all stages of breast cancer with a focus on personalizing all aspects of cancer care, incorporating latest advances in therapeutics, as well as optimization of symptom management strategies and delivery of holistic, person-centered care. Her research is centered on biomarkers of therapeutic response and cancer treatment-related toxicities. Thank you. Welcome so much for being here today. This topic is such an important one.
Thank you so much, Melissa, and really happy to be here with this audience. Thank you so much for all of your interest and participation in this very important topic. Although I'm a breast medical oncologist, as you heard, much of what I will talk about in the future slides really apply to all types of cancer and even to individuals who have not yet been diagnosed with cancer. So I think there's a little bit of information for everyone that I hope you find helpful. A question that we sometimes ask ourselves and patients rightfully ask is, why are clinical trials even important? Why do them? And this may seem like a grandiose statement that I have on this slide, but it's the absolute truth that every single treatment that we have in medicine today, whether it's a cancer treatment or even our usual hypertension medications or cholesterol medication, really every single treatment intervention, whether it's surgical, imaging, or drug-based intervention, really came from very carefully conducted clinical trials, and they entered the market and really became standard of care due to evidence supporting their use. And in addition to the researchers who really contributed and funding agencies that supported these clinical trials, it also is a testimony to all the participants over the years who took a chance and really donated their time and effort to participate in these clinical trials. So it's truly a group effort, all the advances that we have made in medicine today, including cancer treatments. So it's a busy slide here, but I just wanted to kind of ground set us about some of the definitions. I think the most important thing is to realize that clinical research broadly is studies that we do in humans. So that's what makes it a clinical research. And the goal is to find new treatments, to understand the cause of why an illness is happening, and to evaluate whether our interventions are actually helping the condition or not. And in terms of, there are different types of clinical research. We'll talk a little bit about observational studies near the end of the presentation, but also interventional, actually taking a step to address something that's happening, and that's what makes it a clinical trials. And my colleague after me will spend a lot of time speaking about how we safeguard participants so they're as safe as possible during clinical trial participation. So I won't spend too much time on that, but just to say that there are multiple umbrellas and safeguards to ensure that clinical research and clinical trials are done safely. And similarly here, again, nothing is ever done without your permission, and it's absolutely your right to find out as much possible about what the trial is trying to do, but more to come on that. So stay tuned on that. But my role is to tell you about all the different types of clinical trials that we have, and I hope this will kind of clarify just who should participate and why different clinical trials are done. And I have grouped these into 4 different buckets, starting with the first bucket, which I have called risk reduction, screening, or prevention trials. And these are in the individuals who don't have a history of cancer. Then we have therapeutic trials, which may be more known as you think about clinical trials, and then interventional trials, which are treating different symptoms that may be coming from cancer or cancer treatments. And then equally important is the observational study and registry studies, which allow us to bring in large groups of individuals and really collate their data together so that we can better understand disease patterns so that we can help future patients. So starting with screening and prevention risk reduction trials, I think again these could be in individuals who actually don't have a history of cancer, but may have a higher predisposition as a function of their genetics or family history or environmental exposures. And there are multiple studies. It would just be beyond this scope of this talk for me to cover all of these. But I thought, as a point of interest, to highlight a national study that is currently ongoing that illustrates this principle. It's called the Wisdom Study. And the idea is we all know that we should get a mammogram. But what if we really personalize the recommendation of how often a woman should get a mammogram? Whether she should have supplemental imaging, what age should a woman actually start a mammogram? So this is a much more precision medicine-based approach to just saying everybody go get a mammogram at age 40. And so this study is actually essentially is a state-of-the-art screening study to essentially enroll very young women from age 30 to 74 who are living in the US, and really understanding their genetics, understanding their breast density, and really trying to personalize the recommendation for mammogram. So they don't have a history of breast cancer, but the study is trying to answer the question of how to better personalize medicine. There is a lot of screening studies that are working on better understanding different genetic factors. Linda spoke of her history of ovarian cancer. So we have multiple genetic patterns that have been implicated in breast and ovarian cancer, but also other cancers as well. So a lot of our screening studies are focusing on these risk-based assessments to better personalize our treatments. An exciting area of screening studies, which is not quite ready for prime time, is known as multi-cancer early detection. So the idea is that with a blood test, we can actually find the tiniest fragments that are coming from invisible tumor cells that we wouldn't otherwise see on a CAT scan or a PET scan. And by finding these before they actually become visible cancer, we can potentially intervene earlier. So these are known as MSED screening trials, and there is several very large multi-thousand patient clinical trials currently ongoing. And so I think the future could be that with a blood test, we can better identify who's at risk for different cancers. Moving on to treatment therapeutic trials, and a lot of these studies start in the lab. So when we study in cell lines or animal models, and when things look promising, we actually move them into human testing. And the first set of human clinical trials are known as phase 1. These are where we're finding the safe starting dose of the drug. Then they move on to phase 2, where we're beginning to assess the effectiveness. Phase 3 studies are essentially registration studies where successful in comparison to already established therapies, they can actually lead to FDA approval or drug approval. And phase 4 are additional safety analyses are done after a drug has been approved. And so from the time that a study gets conceived of, about 30% of these drugs actually get approved after showing efficacy. And the reason this is important is that tumor cells can be tricky. This is a famous diagram showing all the different ways that cancer cells can actually evade our body's way of eliminating them. So a lot of trials focus on these very mechanistic ways to target different ways that tumor cells can invade our immune surveillance and actually cause metastasis in our body. And so lots of new drugs are focusing on all of these different pathways to more smartly and deliberately try to overcome this. And one newer way of delivering drugs is we all know about chemotherapy. It's an old way of delivering medication, and it's an important way of delivering medication. But in the last 5 to 10 years, the idea of a Trojan horse method of delivering chemotherapy has been developed due to advances in clinical trials. So the idea is, what if we sneak the chemotherapy into the tumor cell and really release the chemotherapy where it's needed, trying to spare some of the normal cells as much as possible. So these are known as antibody drug conjugates. They're not unique to breast cancer. They're being tested across multiple solid tumors as well as hematologic malignancies. And the idea is that we target a certain target on the surface of the tumor cells, then the Trojan horse gets in and releases the load of chemotherapy. And this has absolutely revolutionized the treatment of multiple cancer types. This slide is specific to breast cancer. However, the drug that I'm talking about here, particularly TDXD, is one of our ADCs, now has indications for multiple solid tumors that carry that HER2 protein. So even though the initial approval came in breast cancer, it has rapidly expanded to multiple other tumor types due to advances in clinical trials. Interventional trials highlight that many of our cancer treatments do cause symptoms and toxicities. We have a growing number of cancer survivors expected to reach 26 million in 2040. Thankfully, this is the situation, but many of them have symptoms and toxicities that can include physical effects, psychosocial effects. There are just multiple things that can go on after a cancer diagnosis, as many of you are aware. And in this national survey of multiple types of cancer survivors, you can see that there are many different symptoms that survivors can have. So interventional clinical trials really focus on a variety of these symptoms and try to find very evidence-based ways of addressing these. So this is one example, neuropathy, nerve damage from chemotherapy. We actually have data that moving to music, dance, and rhythmic movement can actually be healing to this neurotoxicity. So this is an example of a National Institute of Health funding that I have with my colleague, where we're actually testing an Argentine tango intervention for neuropathy. So this is an example of an intervention study, just to give you a flavor. And then lastly, observational and registry studies are also important because there is so much we can learn if we group thousands of patients together and try to look at different patterns. And this can be helpful for looking at cancer trends over time, look at different ways that we can kind of mitigate cancer risk, prioritize health resources. And so there's multiple different registries, and you may be approached about participating in them. So they're not a traditional type of clinical trial because nothing is being done to you, but you may be asked to fill out a few questionnaires and share your information. The biggest benefit is that you're helping future patients that come after you. And so, for example, in terms of risk factors of cancer, this is specific to breast cancer, but applies to several other cancers as well. A lot of these factors, the way we have understood them over time has been through the registry and observational studies. So, in terms of how clinical trials are different, I think this will be delved into a little bit more in the next talk. But I think it is research. It's important to know that some of these treatments don't have the strength of evidence to our standard treatments. But again, multiple safeguards are there to protect you. And I think overall, we actually have data that patients who participate in clinical trials actually have better outcomes because multiple eyes are watching them, and just the process of participating in the latest treatment can be beneficial and can actually expand your options. So with that, I'll stop to make sure that we have time for questions after my colleague speaks. And thank you so much for the opportunity to speak to you.
Thank you. That was really an enlightening overview of the opportunities we have. Our next speaker, I'm going to spotlight on. Our next speaker is Nancy Nahmias. It will be speaking about, just as Dr. Lustberg mentioned, the details of joining a clinical trial, including patient rights, patient safety. Nancy boasts over 35 years of invaluable experience as an oncology clinical researcher specializing in patient education across all facets of cancer care, with a particular focus on clinical trials and patient resources. He recently became the Director of Clinical Research at Jupiter Medical Center in Florida. Her most recent position was as Executive Director at Sylvester Comprehensive Cancer Center at the University of Miami. Throughout her career, Nancy has held pivotal positions at several cancer research respected pharmaceutical companies and a leadership role at Yale Cancer Center. They did not overlap, our two speakers, and Northwell Cancer Institute. And that underscores her dedication to pushing the boundaries of oncological research. Not simply content with contributing to research, Nancy has actively championed diversity and inclusion within clinical trials. She serves as president of the CT Clinical Trials Institute and Recruit Media Medical Latino Connect. Nancy, welcome. And I will work on getting your slides up as you.
Thank you. And thank you, Dr. Lustberg. That was a great summary.
Do you see them up? You should.
Oh, there we go.
Okay, great.
Okay. So one of the things that people hear most about clinical trials is that you're just a guinea pig. And in oncology, it's so the opposite. And I feel that it's so important to teach patients about clinical trials and the benefits, because you may one day be approached with one, and this way you'll understand what it is you'll be doing. Next slide, please. So what are clinical trials? Why are they important? We'll go over a little bit more about the types of trials, the phases of trials, and how do they work and who can participate. And then I'll go over some of the common myths and barriers to participation. Next slide. So President Biden actually started the Cancer Moonshot program when his son was dying of brain cancer, and realized that clinical trials were essential for developing new and more effective cancer diagnostics and treatment. But still today, only 5% of cancer patients enroll in clinical trials. And often because patients and doctors know what trials are available, they're not really being asked to enroll in a trial. It's really only if they're going to an academic medical center. Here in Florida, there are some smaller sites that do clinical trials in various diseases, but mostly even in the tri-state area, I would say it's mostly the major cancer centers. Next slide, please. So what's the goal? Well, the goal is to double the rate of progress towards a cure, and to make a decade worth of advances in 5 years. Because really, the more people that participate, the faster research goes. Next slide. And so what are clinical studies? Okay, well, they're research studies that involve humans. We go through 4 phases. We test safety, we determine effectiveness, and we identify side effects. Most treatments we use today are the results of past clinical trials. Next slide. So only 5% of cancer patients in the US participate in clinical trials. And in 2023, 1.9 million people were diagnosed with cancer. 97% of those are receiving standard of care treatment. That percentage is even less for minorities, young adults, and patients over 65. Now, why is this important? Next slide. Well, all the standard of care treatments come from results of clinical trials. I can tell you I'm a little embarrassed, but I've been involved in clinical research since I started out of college 41 years ago. I worked at Sloan Kettering right out of college. I've worked on Zofran, I've worked on carboplatin, nivolumab, many of the new drugs, and many of the old drugs like Taxol and etoposide. And what I've seen over the years is trials provide high quality care. And what I mean by that is you're not just seen by a physician, you're seen by a research nurse, you're seen by a coordinator. They're asking you questions. They're observing your adverse events, your actual side effects. So trials provide innovative state-of-the-art treatments, and they're made available before FDA approval. And I'll explain what the difference is between the trials so you can understand. But trials find better ways to prevent, detect, or treat cancer. And trials help us learn new approaches or combinations of therapies. And just a little story, I remember working at Sloan Kettering, and they were testing out PET scans. And now PET scans are being used for everyone as a diagnostic tool in cancer. So it's just important to understand that what you're receiving today has already gone through a trial. So the next slide. So the types of trials, well, treatment trials, pretty much all cancer trials are treatment studies that involve people who have cancer. It tests new treatments or new ways of using existing treatments. So you may get a drug IV, but then the company comes out with it so you can take it in a pill. Well, they have to retest through all those trials to make sure that the pill is just as effective as the IV. You're getting vaccines, immunotherapy, different approaches to surgery. And as the physician had mentioned, high-PEC chemo. High-PEC chemo is given directly to your disease with ovarian cancer. As a matter of fact, where I am at Jupiter Medical Center, that's a specialty of one of our physicians. Radiation therapy, again, or combination therapy, which could be surgery, radiation, and chemo. Next slide. So prevention trials are studies involving healthy people. I worked on a prevention trial, and it was for breast cancer, for people at risk, high risk for breast cancer. And what they did was they actually gave them a drug to see if it would help them not to get cancer. So most prevention trials, the participants do not have cancer, but they're at high risk of developing the disease, or they've had cancer and at high risk for developing a new cancer. So these studies all look at cancer risks and ways to reduce that risk. Next slide. Screening trials. Well, the goal of screening trials is to test new ways to find a disease early and when it can be easily treated. So an effective screening test will reduce the number of deaths from cancer being screened. And then, as we spoke about, there's quality of life, supportive care, and palliative care trials. So quality of life trials are very important. And now survivorship has become something so important to the NCI that many programs have to include survivorship programs in them in order to get certain certifications for your cancer center. Next slide. So phases of clinical trials. Basically, you need to find a safe dose to decide how the new treatment should be given. Should it be given by mouth? Should it be given in a vein? They also want to see how the new treatment affects your body. We do things such as pharmacokinetic studies. Many of you may be familiar with that. And that's to take blood from your vein to see how the drug goes through your body and how long it takes to peak and how long it takes to leave the body. We also do these to see what type of cancers respond to treatment. And the people taking part are about 15 to 50 patients in phase 1. Most people that participate in phase 1 are really participating because they've exhausted a lot of other options and they're willing to try this in the effort of science. And actually, many of the drugs any of you have taken have gone through phase 1. Next slide. So phase 2, well, this is to determine if the new treatment has any effect on a specific cancer, and also to see how the new treatment affects the body. This is about 100 patients. Next slide. The next slide is phase 3 slides, and this really compares the new treatment or the new use of a treatment with a current standard of care treatment. So many of you may get carbotaxol for ovarian cancer, but they may compare it to a new drug or add immunotherapy. And so we ask that patients participate because we want to make sure that you're getting the best therapy. And the results of these studies, that's actually what ensures that you're getting the best therapy. So the number of people taking part in phase 3 trials is 100 to several thousand. I've worked on many phase 3 trials, and now at Jupiter Medical Center, we probably have at this time about 25 trials going. And the patients, I think, in the community are very appreciative to be able to get these trials locally. Next slide. So randomization, what is randomization? Well, patient information is basically entered into a computer, and the computer randomly assigns patients to 2 or more groups. It's somewhat like the flip of a coin. So someone may get the control standard therapy, and someone may get the investigational drug. Next slide. So really, it compares the two, and many patients
Sorry.
are saying, should I participate? Well, the possible benefits is you'll have access to a new treatment that's not available to people outside the trial. The research team will watch you very closely. If the treatment's being studied is more effective than the standard treatment, you may be among the first to benefit. And I've seen that working with carboplatin. They were actually comparing it to cisplatin, and they had to stop the studies because carboplatin was so much more effective and less toxic. So trial may help scientists learn about cancer and help people in the future. Next slide. So the possible risks of the new treatment may not be better or even as good as standard of care. New treatments that may have side effects that doctors don't expect, or may be worse than those of standard treatment. You might be required to make more visits to the doctor if you were receiving standard treatment. And you may have extra expenses related to those visits, such as travel or childcare costs. And you as a patient have to take all this into consideration. You may need extra tests. Some of the tests could be uncomfortable or time consuming. And even if a new treatment has benefits in some patients, it may not work for you. And health insurance may not cover all patient care costs in a trial. However, in many oncology trials, we try to make sure that whatever is not covered by the patient's insurance, that it actually is covered by the budget of the trial. Next slide. So who can join? Well, they have something called common eligibility criteria. So you have to have a certain type or stage of cancer. You have to have received or not have received a certain kind of therapy in the past, or be in a certain age group, or have a specific medical history or a current health status. Next slide. So I wanted to go over some of the myths about clinical trials. I'm not sure where I am on time, so.
4 minutes?
Okay, I can do this quick. So many people feel that they're being guinea pigs. And they're just wanted to have you all be aware that there's strict guidelines in place to ensure that you and other clinical trial volunteers are treated fairly and ethically. And before an investigational drug is given to people who volunteer to participate in clinical trials, scientists have to complete a rigorous screening, preclinical testing process in animals. It could take up to 6 years to complete animal testing. And then additionally, every clinical trial also has to have a thorough informed consent process, and it will help you to understand your rights as a participant. And you also have the right to leave a trial at any time if you change your mind about wanting to participate. Next slide. So some people who try to volunteer for a clinical trial are told by the research team that they're not allowed to be in. It seems unfair. Well, as we said, every clinical trial has a protocol, which is the plan that describes what will be done during the trial, how the trial will be conducted, and why each part of the trial is necessary. The protocol for clinical trials include eligibility criteria, which can be your stage in the trial. If you do not have the right stage, let's say you're a stage 1 and it's only eligible for stages 3 and 4, that's not the trial for you. Okay. And And there's ways to find trials, and we can go over that as well. But all these criteria are necessary to help the researchers be able to answer the research questions about the drug that they're planning to study. Next slide. So clinical trials are dangerous because they practice new medicine and new practices. Well, I've worked on both device trials and clinical trials for new cancer drugs. And I will tell you that investigational drugs are given to clinical trial participants only after they've gone through rigorous testing. And keeping you safe, and you're participating in the trial, everything is reviewed by an institutional review board. The IRB is a committee made up of doctors, scientists, and community members whose responsibility is to protect the clinical trial participants. We review every study annually, and if any study has an amendment, it also has to be reviewed before the amendment can take place. So basically, during the clinical trial, researchers frequently and rigorously stress and monitor the patient's safety. This is the side effects that we need to know in order to know if the drug is working for you, and also is it too toxic for you at the dose it's being given. Next slide. So if I join a clinical trial, I might get a sugar pill or a placebo. Well, I will tell you that a placebo looks exactly like the drug, but it contains no active ingredients. I have never worked on a placebo trial in 41 years in oncology. And I would say that most IRBs for cancer patients for treatment of disease would probably not consider a placebo trial unless it's mixed with a standard of care regimen. So where you would see a placebo in a cancer trial is, let's say you're getting a standard of care regimen versus a standard of care regimen plus an immunotherapy drug. That's probably the only time you would see, the placebo be the immunotherapy drug. Next slide. So if I join a clinical trial, I won't get the same level of care that I received with my doctor. Well, I'll be honest with you, the clinical trial team will watch you very closely, probably more closely than your own doctor. You will, like I said, see the doctor or a nurse, and also a research coordinator will help to make your appointments to make sure that your care is following the assigned protocol that you've signed up for, because they do not want to violate the protocol, because that is not a good clinical practice. Next slide. So being in a clinical trial does not help the volunteer. Actually, your participation will help to find cures. And again, I like to tell people what I've worked on, because many of these drugs started as clinical trials. Carboplatin, Taxol, etoposide, which is VP16, nivolumab, and daratumumab. There's many of them, and they're all now marketed drugs, and they wouldn't have come to fruition and been able to help many of the patients today if they didn't go through clinical trials. So volunteering for a clinical trial can help you immensely, and it also helps the general public. Next slide. And that's pretty much it. That's our new Cancer Institute.
Thank you so much. So much great information. I am going to bring us all back. I saw questions come in as you were both speaking, and yeah, the Mythbusters. Thank you. Yeah, the Mythbusters were really great. And we have a lot of great questions, and I want to try and get to as many of them as possible. So, and I think unless there's one that's very obvious that goes to one or the other of you, I'll let you decide where the answer would best come from.
Mm-hmm.
So the first question is, when is the best time and what is the best way to bring clinical trials up with your doctor? And then what if the doctor dismisses you? What if, you don't live in an area where there's a major academic center and so the doctor says, no, there's nothing right for you right now. There's nothing here for you right now. What's the next step you can take if you want to learn more?
There's a national movement by the American Society of Clinical Oncology, which is the main organization for oncologists, entitled Just Ask. And it's been a campaign to really get both oncologists as well as patients aware that having a dialogue about clinical trials is just a normalized thing, that we need to bring it up. It may not be the right thing for you at that juncture, but to not be afraid to have a discussion about it. So I think just like anything else in your cancer care, I think being able to feel comfortable to ask questions and bring up concerns, clinical trials are just that as well. So I think if you feel comfortable with your medical team, I think I mean, I don't want to say should, because I know it can be intimidating to be on the other side, and so I don't want to trivialize that question in any way, because I know that some of us physicians may not be as open and inviting. So I do want to say that that does happen. But I think with the right team, you should be able to ask. And if they're not willing to answer your questions, I think using some patient forums to kind of look for opportunities. There are search engines where you can actually search for trials, but it's really important for you to know all your options.
Yeah, thank you. So that leads to two different questions. Oh, so right there, somebody putting clinicaltrials.gov. So two-part question. I do want to talk about where some of those search engines that are reputable are, but I also want to talk for a second and just ask, like, what if you don't live near where these clinical trials are happening? How is access involved here? How can we make that happen? Or is that just not an option if you don't live nearby? Nancy, this might be a
Nancy,
good
do you want
question
to
for
start?
you. Yeah.
Well, first off, just as an add-on to Dr. Lustberg's comment, one of the most important things in finding a clinical trial is to know your disease, know your stage, know your pathology, have the details of your disease, because you're going to need them if you go on clinicaltrials.gov to look for anything. And again, there may not be an academic medical center near you, but there could be a private oncologist near you that conducts clinical research, or a community hospital. That's like Jupiter. We're a community hospital, but we are 2 hours in either direction from any major cancer center. So people have to go somewhere to get chemo. And, they want the best trials, which is why we're building a program.
Yeah, that's great.
Yeah.
Okay, so clinicaltrials.gov is a great place to go. There's a place on Sharsheret's website that has and I'll talk more about that toward the end, that also has some great information about specific clinical trials. Are there any other sites? And because of what Sharsheret is, that cater to breast and ovarian cancer, or that are particularly good for those cancers?
The Metastatic Breast Cancer Alliance hosts a search engine for breast cancer trials. GRASP, GRASP, is another search site for different trials. Yes, but clinicaltrial.gov, if you just know, to Nancy's wonderful point, if you know the key aspects of your cancer, I feel like that's the most comprehensive site, because if you just put in those keywords, you will essentially have all the available clinical trials at your fingertips and the locations. And I think with every trial, I think it's a balancing act between how time intensive it is, what is it giving you over standard of care treatment, and what is the time toxicity of it. I mean, I think if you're having to commute 3 to 4 hours and having to take a flight to nobody is suggesting that necessarily. So I think it's a discussion, and just learning what the clinical trial alternative is will actually help you understand your standard of care treatment options just even better. So even entertaining that helps you understand your disease process, to Nancy's point. So
Great.
even if you end up not doing it, I think that information is very powerful.
Thank you. All right, I know we have a lot to get to, so a quick yes or no answer. Can Canadians access the trials that are in the US?
Yes, but I believe it depends on insurance.
Okay, so it's worth looking into, but there are no guarantees. Okay,
Right.
perfect. The clinicaltrials.gov, does that includes all the different types of trials we spoke about today? Pre-cancer, lifestyle, anything on holistic and
Yes.
integrative medicine there?
Yes.
Yes.
Yes. As long as they have registered it under clinicaltrial.gov, which any reputable trial needs to be. Now, there are certain centers, that may say something is a clinical trial, but they haven't registered it, etc. But otherwise, anything that is validated and scientific should be in clinicaltrial.gov, and you should be able to find it there.
Perfect. How do we, if we're interested in a particular trial that we've researched or someone else told us about, does our doctor need to recommend us to this trial? Can we self-select and reach out directly? How does that work?
You can self-select. You can contact the physician in charge of the study. Their number would be available, as would be their study coordinator on clinicaltrials.gov. And you can contact them directly, or you can have your doctor forward. It depends on your doctor. Most doctors would be happy to send you somewhere else. Some doctors may say, oh, no, I can give you the best treatment. But you, as the patient, it is your choice. So,
Thank you for that. There were a lot of individual questions that came through. I'm looking for a trial for triple negative, for hormone receptor positive, for OCs, ovarian cancer stage 4, for exercise, for this, for that. So we've sort of wrapped that all up in clinicaltrials.gov and the other places. In addition to what Nancy and Dr. Lustberg have said, some of our participants have put things into the chat box to be aware of, like for ovarian cancer, the Clarity Foundation has a list. Somebody mentioned an MSK trial that involves exercise. But I do want to focus on one particular potential trial because I think it's so cutting edge and interesting and important. Can you talk very briefly about any trials for cancer vaccines?
A lot of really interesting immune-based interventions in multiple cancer types. So they may include cancer vaccines, they may include cell-based therapies, they may include novel immunotherapeutic indications. So I would say this is absolutely worth exploring. I think many of these are not in place of our standard therapies, but as the chat participant mentioned in one of the further up comments, a lot of times they can be a wonderful adjunct to some of our existing therapies to help solidify kind of the gains that we have made with our traditional therapy. So definitely, depending on your condition, look into vaccine therapies. They have come a long way, but they're in no way a replacement to kind of the traditional, more traditional therapies.
Okay. And then but a vaccine in the more traditional sense for to stop someone from a diagnosis occurring. Would someone, just an average person off the street, be able to be taken into a trial like that, or it's only for people with high risk? Or
Yeah, so they all have different criteria. I know of one breast cancer prevention vaccine study with one of the sites being Cleveland Clinic. Dr. Tom Budd, B-U-D-D, is the lead investigator. So yes, there are definitely preventative vaccine trials, and there are also vaccine trials for patients who already have had a cancer diagnosis with more of like a maintenance risk reduction strategy after.
Perfect. Last question. So, Dr. Lustberg, you talked about MSED, these
Yes.
blood tests that
Yes.
might, prior to when a screening, a cancer screening, might be able to detect cancer in our blood. You said they're not really ready for prime time. So, I guess two questions here based on what people asked. One is, when might they be ready for prime time? And two is, are you talking about tests like the Gallery test, which isn't FDA approved but already in use? And why is it in use if it's not FDA approved? And is it worth considering?
Really great question. So yeah, the Gallery test is one of many MSET tests. There are multiple companies and multiple platforms testing ways where we can detect just minuscule remnants of early signs of cancer in our blood. So there's been a lot of direct to consumer advertising of these tests because they are essentially commercial assays, and we're all anxious and want the state of the art testing to find cancer. But the reason they're not approved is that their sensitivity, how well they can pick up occult cancers, and their specificity. Are they, when they're picking up a signal, is it truly a cancer signal, or is it a red herring, essentially putting a patient in a tailspin, thinking they might have cancer, but nobody can find it? So I think they need a little bit more fine tuning, and the type of cancer signals they can pick up can be quite variable. So they may be sensitive in one area, but not as sensitive in other tumor types. So I think we need a little bit larger, multi-thousand patient studies are currently ongoing to kind of better refine the technology. So my main worry about patients going and kind of paying for these out of pocket even is that we still don't fully know that they're as accurate as they should be, although they profess to be. And if you end up having a false positive, that state of anxiety and worry and not knowing what to do with the information, I think, is a terrible state to be in. But certainly patients can make up their more mind about that. But I think they need a little bit more refinement before they're quite ready.
That false positive, I guess, even as bad as that is not as bad as a false negative. So I guess we're still waiting for her. Okay, amazing. All right, listen, we have still a lot to accomplish. So I want to thank our speakers for this evening. Thank you to Dr. Maryam Lustberg. Thank you to Nancy Nahmias, for sharing their unique experience and passions, honestly, clearly passions with us this evening. And thank you so much to Linda for sharing her own story. I learned so much this evening, and I hope you did too. So I'm going to just share a couple more things. And before I share my final thoughts, those who are impacted by metastatic breast cancer or advanced ovarian cancer and are planning on staying for a more intimate conversation with our speakers, please stay where you are. And as the main part of the webinar concludes, Bonnie will start the breakout session. I want to once more thank our generous sponsors, including Daiichi Sankyo, Eisai, GSK, PMV Pharma, and the cooperative agreement DP 240061 from the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention. Please take a moment to fill out a brief evaluation study on today's program. It's linked in the chat box now, and you can click it and still hear the last of what I'm saying. But please note, if you are planning on staying for that Embrace breakout, Bonnie will share that link again because there is a question there about the breakout. Please remember, Char Sherrod is here for you and your loved ones. We provide emotional support, mental health counseling, and other programs designed to help you navigate through the cancer experience. All are free and completely confidential. And if you reach out to the email address, clinicalstaff@charcheret.org, someone will be back to you within 24 hours. As I mentioned, Charcheret also has a clinical trial finder on our website. You can find it in the link that's now going in the chat box. And then finally, I want to let you know that we have several exciting webinars on a wide range of topics planned for the coming weeks, including something on lymphedema risk reduction this Thursday evening, something on managing financial toxicity the following week, next week, and then parenting with cancer and a Shalom Shabbat Hanukkah program the week after that. So check those out on our events page, which is linked in the chat right now. All of those links will be in a follow-up email that will come to you as soon as the video recording is ready, and we'll include a link for that as well. Again, thank you all for coming, and thank you to our presenters, Linda and Nancy and Dr. Lustberg, and have a wonderful evening.